Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reform GGA, and today I'm going to be doing a little bit different video. I'm going to be doing a basic how to use video on modernized AK type rifles like this one here. What inspired this is the fact that a friend of mine is considering using a gun that is not too dissimilar from this, has a similar furniture set, similar optic setup and things like that, in an upcoming hunt with his daughter. And so I just wanted to give him a little bit of heads up on how the system works and things like that. This is definitely not his normal hunting rifle. He would normally use something much more practical. That's just kind of the guy that he is. He's a family man, and his priorities are straight, which means that most of his money goes into, feeding his family and taking care of them. And so when he gets guns for, recreational purposes, practical hunting purposes, those kinds of things, they don't tend to be very ornate. A lot of times used guns, the lower end of the spectrum as far as optics are concerned, things like that. And so guns like this, that once you get them all kitted out, usually cost at least $1,000, if not, maybe sometimes closer to $1,500, depending on exactly how far you go in tricking them out. Not going to be his thing. He would be borrowing that AK type rifle for the hunt. It's not something that he would normally buy for himself because, like I said, normally his money goes into providing for his family, which is not a bad thing at all. His priorities are straight, like I said. But there are those of us who know him, who do have access to these kinds of guns, and we're making this kind of thing available to him just because these kinds of guns do have a little bit of an advantage for the shooting situation that he's in, and that is particularly his daughter is a little bit recoil shy, suffers a little bit of shot anticipation with the hunting rifles, and there's lots of people that would be in that category. Typical hunting rifles are a little unforgiving when it comes to those kinds of things. They're typically very lightweight, which is great for carrying them across the countryside for long distances, but a lightweight rifle tends to have more felt recoil. They're also usually full-size rifle cartridges like 7mm 08, 30-06, 308. Those cartridges tend to be more than a little punishing, just in terms of the amount of power that is involved there. They're full-size rifle cartridges and a relatively small platform, and then the scopes that they have on them typically have a relatively short eye relief. Sometimes it's sometimes not much more than an inch of eye relief, maybe an inch and a half on some of them. And so you have to get your eye pretty much right up next to it, which means that if you do not have that stock really locked into your chest so that it cannot move back on you at all, it's not that hard to bob yourself in the eye with a scope. And somebody who's gotten close to that and didn't want to do it again, they can become pretty sensitive to recoil, and it's just not a good thing. And so when you're dealing with somebody like that, either you can take them out with the family 30-06 and just make them go through round after round after round after round until eventually they get over it, or you can give them something that's not going to be as punishing in terms of the recoil, and that's where the AK pattern rifle is coming in for him. These guns are nice in that regard because they are typically quite a bit heavier than your typical hunting rifle. This one right here weighs in, I think, at around 9.5 pounds or something like that. I think with a fully loaded 30-round magazine, it puts it pretty close to 10, I think. No, I take that back. It's 9 3/4. But anyways, almost a 10-pound rifle, so that tends to absorb a lot of recoil. And of course, the cartridge that this gun shoots, like most AKs, would be 7.62 by 39, which is not a full power rifle cartridge. It's considered an intermediate cartridge. And so there's not as much power to begin with in a heavier platform. And then on top of that, the scopes that he would be using would be very similar to this one. This is a Primary Arms 2X prism scope. The one he would use would probably be a 3X. But both of them have a very forgiving eye box and a fairly long eye relief. You can be quite a bit behind the optic and still be able to use it well. You don't have to get right up next to it like you do with a lot of the more typical hunting scopes. And so that is a nice feature for people that tend to suffer from shot anticipation. So this kind of gun has a lot of advantages for someone like that. And if somebody that you know already has one and they'll let you borrow it for a time, it makes sense to use it. So let's talk about some of the basics on how to use a setup like this one. Now, of course, things are going to vary from one particular model to another and how things get set up. So what I'm doing here is talking mostly about what Palmetto State Armory, because that is what this is. This is a Palmetto State Armory gun. I'm going to be talking about what they would call their MOEkov rifles. It has the MOE handguard. It has the Zhukov folding stock. All right, so let's start with the tip. The tip of most of these modernized AKs is going to have some kind of a muzzle device. Most of these muzzle devices are either going to be muzzle rise compensators, meaning they're meant to keep the rifle down so that it doesn't pivot up on you, and this particular one has that functionality. And also there are some of them that will work as brakes, which are meant to arrest the rearward movement of the gun and make the recoil impulse a little bit lighter. This one is a dual muzzle device that actually does both. You see that the bottom of the muzzle device is completely blocked off, meaning that all the gases escape out of the top, and that pushes the barrel down a little bit to keep it from rising on you. And the way that those slots are cut in such a way that they actually force some of the vented air backwards, and so there is a slight brake effect. This one is not as strong a brake as some others have, but it does have a slight brake effect as well. And going back from there, you get to the gas block. There's lots of different styles on AKs now for the gas block. This one is kind of the archetypical 45-degree gas block. They also make one that has a 90-degree gas block. Some of them will have the front sight integrated with the gas block. Regardless though, this is the main piece that makes this gun work. What happens is that as the bullet is leaving the barrel, before it actually leaves, what will happen is the gas from the explosion inside the chamber will get redirected up into this top tube, and that will drive a piston that cycles the rest of the action of the gun. So without that little gas block, this thing would not be a semi-auto, or in the case of the military version, a full auto. It would not be a self-loading rifle with that there. Now on this particular model that I have here, I have a white light that is on it. On most hunting guns, you're not going to want to light on the gun for legal reasons. Here in Idaho, you are allowed to have an illuminated reticle in the optic that's visible to you, but you're not allowed to project any kind of light, whether it be white light or infrared or anything like that. That is verboten, and you're also not allowed to use night vision. So on a hunting rifle, this would not be on there, but all it is basically is just a little flashlight that attaches to the gun. All right, coming back from there, you would have the MOE handguard, and the bottom of the handguard, the bottom piece here, has a heat shield in it, and it is intended that you would grip primarily that handguard. Now, I a lot of times will put my hand over it when I'm shooting off the shoulder. I'll put my thumb over it, and that is fine to do, but understand that that top part does not have a heat shield in it, so if you do a lot of shooting that way, it will eventually warm up to the point where it will be quite uncomfortable. Also be aware that the front part of the top handguard and the bottom part of the handguard are metal, and those heat up real quick, so if your thumb slips forward a little bit onto that metal, you can get burned. If it slips back a little bit onto that metal, you can get burned, so be aware of that. If you want to be safe, keep your hand on the lower part of the handguard, and you'll avoid most of the burning type problems. Now, as far as sights are concerned, pretty much all AKs will come with some fairly rudimentary iron sights. And for hunting purposes, you'll usually not want to adjust it too much. And how accurate they are depends on the manufacturer. PSA does not tend to make these very accurately, so it's usually better to pick one of the settings. It's a ladder type you squeeze, and then you can move it to the different designations. And theoretically, each one of these numbers would correspond to a number of meters, because of course AKs are metric guns. They're not an American design, so they're not going to be using American standard units. So this would be in meters, 100 meters, 200, 300, all the way up to 800 meters. On some AK variants, depending on the caliber, sometimes they go out to 1,000. Nobody in their right mind really expects an AK to be able to shoot 1,000 yards. That's not really what that's there for. In the military doctrine that was used to formulate the AK, they did consider area targets to be a viable thing. That is basically when you would blanket an area with suppressive fire, not really picking out a specific point target, but just laying cover down on a general area, and that's why they go out to 800 meters or 1,000 meters or something like that. That's when you're trying to lay down suppressive fire on an entire area. If you're going after point targets, it's usually more like going to be 100 or 200, maybe 300 meters. All right. And it works by a fairly simple notch and post principle. At the rear, there's a little notch, and you look down that notch to a post that is in the front sight block, and you basically line it up like you would a typical pistol sight. So you put the post in the middle of the notch, make sure they're flat, make sure the post isn't too far to one side or the other. Let me see if I can give you somewhat of a visual representation. So you'll have the notch in the back, and the front post you want to be in the middle. You don't want it to be off to one side or the other side. You don't want it to be high. You don't want it to be low. You want it basically be in the middle. You want a nice you want your sight picture to have a nice flat profile to it. And like I said, that front post basically right in the middle. Not to the side or the other side, not high, not low, right in the middle. Nice flat cover for your sight picture. However, for hunting purposes and whatnot, I wouldn't recommend using iron sights unless you absolutely had to. That is, the magnified scope dies for whatever reason. But that is the basic idea behind that. And then let's go ahead and get into the scope. On a lot of these modernized AKs, the way that you put scopes on them is with a side rail. And the side rail is a design that, of course, was started in Russia, and they really didn't take the design as far as it could have gone. It actually wound up being American manufacturers for the civilian market that really brought it into its own. And the two best rails, as far as I'm concerned, there's, well, not rails, but the mounts that go onto the rails. So this big complicated thing right here is the mount, and then the rail is underneath that. The two best ones that I've seen on the market are this RS Regulate type, and these RS Regulate types are actually modular. You get different upper pieces and different lower pieces, kind of mix and match and do what you want with. And then the other one is the AK Master Mount system. Both of those are incredibly solid designs and very, very, very useful for a modern AK users. First of all, they mount very solidly, and so they hold zero real well. And since it's a rail type system that they attach to, and it's not a hard connection like directly attaching to Picatinny or M-lock slots or something like that, it's detachable for the gun, which makes disassembly and cleaning and that kind of thing a lot easier. The downside to using this kind of system is, of course, that the mount is going to cost quite a bit, which is another thing that keeps these kinds of guns out of the market for some people. These mounts are usually over $100, usually not more than $150, but somewhere in that range. $100 to $150 is not uncommon for these mounts. Then, of course, the cost of the optic. And then, since this tends to raise things above where the standard iron sights would be, you usually have to get some kind of a cheek riser in order to use the scope effectively. And that has to all be taken into account. Now, like I said, these things do take apart relatively easily for disassembly purposes and cleaning purposes, or like I said, in the case that the optic for whatever reason happens to break, you can strip down these extra parts and go back to using the iron sights. And the nice thing about iron sights is that once you get them in, they usually work just fine. To do that, you would usually take off the cheek riser, and this one's just a little bit tight. This one is one of the Magpul models, and so it's just tensioned on. So take it off. The reason why I have tape on the stock is not because the stock broke. It's because the stock, when I'm using the iron sights, tends to pull beard hair, and so I have a little bit of tape right over where my beard would usually sit on the stock, and the rest of the tape is to hold that piece of tape on there. That's the reason why I do that. So yeah, it looks kind of weird, but it's not because the stock broke or anything. It's just because I don't like getting my beard hair pulled. Once you get the cheek riser off, you will want to remove anything that could get in the way of sliding off the mount. So if you happen to have something in this little hole here, usually like a sling attachment or something like that, that's what this hole is meant for, you'll of course want to take that off, pull up the lever, and then it should just slide right off from there. And then you have your AK in its base configuration, and you should be able to use the iron sights like that. Like I said, for hunting purposes, that's not what I would recommend. One, because it lightens up the gun, and if you're intending to use this gun with someone who is recoil sensitive, who suffers from shot anticipation, lightening the gun up is not going to help them. And then also it tends to make that shooter less accurate, frankly because using iron sights effectively is difficult for a lot of people, and AK iron sights are not terribly forgiving. They can be used, and I've seen people use them quite effectively out to even 600 yards, but those are people who spend a lot of time shooting iron AK sights, and also people who invest a lot of time in figuring out the particular nuances of their gun. They spend a lot of time with them trying to figure that all out, and also use pretty high quality ammunition to augment the system as a whole. Okay. So not what I would normally recommend doing, but if you're in a pinch and for some reason the primary optic goes down, you can do that and it will work. In terms of disassembly, the disassembly process isn't too complicated. First, of course, make sure that the gun is unloaded, and then so make sure that there's nothing in the mag well. Pull, I forgot to specify. Okay, so make sure that there's nothing in the mag well. Pull the safety down. Pull back on the charging handle. Visually inspect your chamber, and then you can begin the disassembly process. There's a little tab right here on the back of the gun. You just push that in and pull up slightly. And that will loosen up the top cover, and then you can pull the top cover right back. That will expose the guts of the gun. Recoil spring comes out first. Just push forward and then it comes back. Not a big issue. Take the safety down. Pull the bolts and bolt carrier back. And that is as far as you normally need to take down an AK. With my friend, I'm going to suggest that he not do this, just because AKs, for one, you usually don't have to disassemble too often anyways. It's not uncommon for people to go 500 rounds before cleaning their AK. That's not uncommon at all. So it's not really necessary. And also a lot of AK owners usually have their own little cleaning regimen and all that. And so if he's borrowing someone else's gun, it's usually best to let them do their own cleaning on it and, you know, maintain their own cleaning regimen and all those kinds of things. When you reinstall, I forgot to say this, when you reinstall the bolts and bolt carrier, the bolt needs to be all the way forward. I'll go ahead and show you how that works here real quick. Alright, so the bolt can, of course, come out of the bolt carrier. To put it in, you just go ahead and slide it in, and then you rotate the bolts basically until it won't rotate anymore. And then you keep tension on it, trying to rotate it as you pull it forward, and it will basically roll into place. And this is how you want to put it back in the gun. So I'm going to reorient it facing downward so that the bolt will stay in the forward position. And then put the front end into the gas tube. Push down, and the whole thing slides forward. And then the recoil spring goes in the hole on the back of the bolt carrier. There is a little dovetail here on the back of the receiver that recoil spring will fit into, just like that. And then the hard part is always getting the dust cover back on. there is a slot right up here above the bolt carrier that the front end will fit into, and then you're basically going to have to pound it down over the release button. So go ahead and slide it forward into there, and then you should be able to just push down directly. It usually takes a little bit of force, and that one I got it misaligned on, so that one didn't work. Pull it back out, try this again. There we go. It's sometimes a little bit of a balancing act to get the right amount of forward pressure on it with the right amount of downward pressure on it, but fiddle with it enough and you'll eventually figure it out. Go ahead and give it a function check. So pull back on the bolts, make sure it's of course empty, which you hopefully did in the disassembly process. Pull the trigger, keep the trigger back, pull again, release, make sure that it strings into place. Go ahead and put the safety up, make sure that you can't pull the trigger, put the safety down, make sure that you can, and it is in good working order. All right, and then to reinstall the optic, it's basically just the reverse of what you did before. We'll start with the optic and rail, oh sorry, the optic and mount that goes on the rail. Just slides on there. This is frankly not as easy to do from this position. And then once you got it fully forward, push the little locking lever back down. Make sure that it's not loose, because if it's loose then you're going to have problems with holding zero and all that kind of thing, and you don't want that. Alright, and then on this model we'll go ahead and put back on the cheek riser. If you have a sling on it, you can go ahead and reinstall the sling. Some slings will install forward on these MOE stocks. There's a hole in the back of the MOE stock that can also be used, but you have to get a special attachment to fit in there, a special piece that fit in there. Then of course there's a loop on the bottom, so some of them will interfere with the optic, some of them won't. If you have one of the ones that interferes with the optic, you'll have to take it out first. Right. And then the cheek piece should just snap into place fairly easy. And then in terms of setting it up for the individual user, I really like these MOEkov stocks because they give you some good adjustability that way. First, they are folding, so there's a button on the side. And so for storage purposes, makes it a little bit more compact package. You can fit it in a smaller case, those kinds of things. That is nice. And then for the individual user, there's these little locking notches underneath that you can use to set the distance. And the way that you do that is with this button on the rear. You pull it down for that lever that's underneath. So pull it kind of like a trigger, and I can open it up quite a bit to get a much longer length of pull, or I can compact it down, just kind of wiggle it out to fit intermediate places. I usually like it one notch out, and that works for most of the people that I have shoot these guns. But yeah, that is how the stock would work. And then of course, as far as actually going out and shooting it, you'll of course load your magazine like you would load most rifle magazines from the top. Make sure they're slided all the way back. For most people that go hunting with these kinds of guns, they usually use a fairly short magazine because it's less likely to snag on stuff. And for most hunting, you usually don't need a ton of rounds, so they'll use something like this. Of course, load it with rounds. And then it's an AK, so it rocks and locks, so you put it almost parallel to the gun, tip it in, and just rock it into place, and you should hear that loud snapping, clicking type sound. So parallel, in, and then wait to hear the click. And then to load it, you of course drop the safety. You always have to drop the safety with these guns. Pull back on the charging handle, let it fly forward, put the safety back on, and this thing is ready to go. When you're out in the field and you're actually ready to shoot, all that you'll do is you'll simply get on target. With these modern ones that have the enhanced safeties, you'll just use your trigger finger to pull down the safety and then fire. Now this safety can be a little bit loud, and depending on the hunting situation, that of course can be a bad thing. So to avoid making too much noise in the field before you get the shot off, obviously when you shoot there's going to be a lot of noise, and that has the potential to scare away whatever you're trying to shoot at. But hopefully you hit your mark and that's not an issue. But you don't want to spook the animal before you actually shoot it. And so to operate the safety as quietly as possible, you grab the front part of the safety instead of the enhanced tab. Grab the front part, pull it out from the gun a little bit, and then move that down, and it'll make a lot less noise. And then you can go back up, get on target, and pull the trigger. Now, of course, this particular one uses a standard AK trigger. There are ones that have a little bit better trigger, but most of them, even with the better triggers, are still going to be single stage triggers, which a lot of hunters don't like as much. But the trick there is basically just to get used to it. Figuring out how much creep there is. In an AKs, there tends to be quite a bit of creep. And then basically, for people that are going for really accurate shots, take up as much as the creep as you feel comfortable with. Pause, make sure that you're precise, and then pull the rest of the way through. And the nice thing about these guns is that dry firing them really doesn't hurt them. So as long as the gun is empty, and of course we had an empty gun and an empty magazine, personally I would not recommend testing it with a mag in it just because it develops bad habits. I just did that for demonstration purposes only. But with the gun completely empty, chamber checked, the nice thing is you can keep pulling the trigger dry, pulling the trigger dry, pulling the trigger dry on these guns without it really incurring any major damage. So you can get really used to how that trigger operates. About how much slack you have, pause, take a breath, whatever you need to do, pull the rest of the way through, and get a fairly precise shot. This particular gun with good ammo, I'm actually able to get about 1.1 MOA out of it, which is really good for an AK. Not all AKs are going to shoot like that. This one has a nitride barrel, which tends to be more accurate. And like I said, you do really need good ammo to do that. The ammo that I use when I do that is usually boat tail ammo. And if you guys know much about ammunition, you know that boat tail ammo is usually going to cost you a bit. That kind of thing. It is actually a lot more accurate than a lot of people think that it is. But part of the reason why people don't usually do very good with AKs is because they don't master that trigger pull. It's not like any of the two-stage hunting guns. It's not like a precision rest gun. So you really need to get used to the trigger pull. But once you do that, they tend to perform very well. And of course, with it being a auto-loading gun, the next shot, of course, is going to be ready as soon as you fire off the first shot. The first shot gets fired off, and then the gun cycles. Another round is put into the chamber, and you can go again if you need to, which is also nice for a hunting situation in that if you miss your first shot, and you should practice enough that you're not going to miss your first shot, but if for some reason you do happen to miss the first shot, you have the immediate option of following up and potentially getting the prey. Or if you did happen to hit the animal but not in a good spot, just enough to wound it, of course you're going to want to take another shot. And this one not needing to be manually reloaded, of course, greatly quickens up that time and makes it much more likely that you're going to be able to get that follow-up shot in a timely manner and minimize the amount of suffering that the animal is going to have to go through. Ethical hunting, you're always trying to get the quickest, most humane dispatch of the animal that is possible. But like I said, if something goes wrong, it's nice to be able to follow up as quickly as possible to put the animal out of its misery. Alright, and so that is the basic operation. I should say also how to unload the gun. So for unloading, there is a little tab that's in front of the trigger guard. You pull that forward, and then you tilt the magazine forward. So mag release forward, magazine forward. Then, of course, to run the action, you always have to take the safety off. Run the action, check the chamber and make sure that it is clear, and that is how you unload the gun. Go ahead and put it back on safety. And that is pretty much all the basics that I can think of. In terms of slings, they'll usually be mounted to the left side of the gun because the left side of the gun usually is a little bit smoother. Obviously the mount kind of gets away, but the left side of the gun is usually a little bit smoother and a little bit more convenient to carry on that side. So there's a little ring up at the front that is used for the forward position of the sling, and then you usually have a few different options on the stock. Like I said, there's a hole down here, there's a hole here, but I don't have the hardware that would be necessary to use that hole, and then a sling mount back here as well. So yeah, there's that. I've already talked about the heat shield and the handguard. It may be worth pointing out, depending on who you are and what you're doing, but some of these grips have a little compartment in them, like this one does, and that little compartment is very often used for batteries for the optic. This one doesn't have anything in it, it's just hollow. But some of them will have a spare battery for the optic. It's usually the biggest dial is the one that includes the battery. Because like I said, in Idaho we're allowed to have illuminated reticles, we're just not allowed to put any light downrange, and we're also not allowed to use night vision. But an illuminated reticle is perfectly legal. It's not useful in all cases. Outside in bright sunlight, a prism scope will usually show up just fine. You need the illumination. It's only in low light that you need the illumination, really, but that's not really here or there. And just like on any other standard scope, there is an ocular at the rear that will twist and adjust to the individual person's eye. I think that pretty well covers the basic operation, usage, disassembly, reassembly, all that kind of stuff that the normal person would have to do. You will notice that there's a little takedown lever at the front that is for taking off the gas tube. That is not a normal part of AK maintenance that you have to do every single time. It's more like every other time kind of thing. And for my particular friend, like I said, he's going to be borrowing someone else's AK. They usually have their own cleaning procedures and whatnot that they like to do, and so he's not going to disassemble the gun at all, most likely. But yeah. Alright, that takes care of that, I suppose. Thank you all for watching and listening, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the AK platform, hopefully that gave you a little bit more intuition into how that it works and gives you a little bit better understanding of the mechanics. Basic operation, those kinds of things. This wasn't meant to be anything earth-shattering, and it probably wasn't. But for people who are unfamiliar with the platform, hopefully it showed you a little bit. Thank you all for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you will come to know Him, the true Savior of humanity. Amen.